Sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the darkest moments. When a helpless creature faces death alone, it takes only one person with courage to change everything. In a dusty Montana town during the late 1800s, a cruel drunkard leaves his battered dog bleeding in the street, abandoned to fate. As dusk settles, a cowboy known for keeping his distance from folks finds the wounded animal. Against the whispers of townsfolk who say the dog is beyond saving, he nurses it back to health. But as the animal recovers, its loyalty reveals a dark secret. The dog witnessed the owner's involvement in violent crimes, plaguing the territory. Now the cowboy and his four-legged companion must stand against both the drunken brute and the outlaws who shield him. What happens when a man's compassion puts him on a collision course with the most dangerous criminals in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Copper Ridge, Montana, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden buildings that lined the main street. Dust motes danced in the amber light, filtering through saloon windows, where the sound of clinking glasses and muted conversation provided the town's evening soundtrack. It was the kind of place where folks minded their own business, where a man could disappear into the landscape if he chose to, and where the past stayed buried as deep as the men who carried too much of it. Ezra Kane had been carrying too much for longer than he cared to remember. At 43, his weathered face told the story of a man who'd seen more than his share of suffering his own and others. The lines around his eyes weren't from squinting against the Montana sun, though he'd done plenty of that in his 2 years of drifting through these territories. They were from nights spent tending to dying soldiers, from holding young men's hands while they whispered their mothers' names into the darkness of Civil War field hospitals. His horse, a steady bay mare named Belle, picked her way carefully through the rutted street as Ezra guided her toward Murphy's boarding house. The worn saddlebags draped across Belle's flanks contained everything Ezra owned in the world. A few changes of clothes, his father's service revolver wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a leather satchel filled with medical supplies he'd never been able to abandon, and a daguerreotype of a woman whose memory had grown both sharper and more painful with each passing year. The medical supplies were what set Ezra apart from other drifters. He'd trained as an army medic during the war, learning to patch up broken bodies with steady hands and a steady heart. Even now, years after hanging up his uniform, he couldn't pass a wounded animal or injured person without stopping to help. It was both a blessing and a curse. His skills were welcome everywhere, but his compulsion to heal meant he could never quite escape the suffering that seemed to follow him from town to town. Doc Harwell emerged from his clinic just as Ezra dismounted, wiping his hands on a stained apron. The old physician had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the sort of gentle manner that put people at ease, even when delivering difficult news. He'd been the town doctor for nearly 20 years, arriving fresh from medical school back east, with grand plans for bringing modern medicine to the frontier. Those plans had been tempered by reality, but his dedication had never wavered. "Evening, Kane," Doc called out, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who'd breathed too much prairie dust. "Planning to stay the night?" "Figured I might," Ezra replied, running a hand along Belle's neck. "Town seems peaceful enough." Doc chuckled, though there was something hollow in the sound. "Peaceful's one word for it. Though I suppose every place has its troubles." He glanced toward the saloon, where lamplight spilled through the bat-wing doors. "Martha's got a good stew going tonight. Might want to stop by before it's all gone." Martha Cordova ran the Silver Dollar Saloon with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with steel-grey eyes that missed nothing and hands that were equally skilled at pouring whiskey or ejecting troublemakers. Her late husband had left her the saloon and a reputation for fairness that made her place neutral ground for most disputes. Men might settle their differences with fists or firearms in the street, but inside Martha's establishment they kept their voices down and their weapons holstered. Ezra had learned to read towns the way some men read weather patterns. Copper Ridge felt like a place holding its breath, waiting for something to break the surface tension that kept everything in precarious balance. Sheriff Murphy was competent enough, but he had the look of a man who'd grown tired of fighting battles he couldn't win. The merchants conducted their business with the kind of nervous efficiency that suggested they'd learned not to ask too many questions about their customers or their money. As Ezra led Bell toward the livery stable, a commotion near the saloon caught his attention. Raised voices, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, and then the distinctive yelp of an animal in pain. He'd heard that sound too many times during the war, the cry of a creature caught in the crossfire of human brutality. Silas Grady stumbled out of the Silver Dollar, his massive frame swaying with the particular instability of a man who'd been drinking since noon. He was the sort of drunk who grew meaner with each shot of whiskey, his already limited capacity for kindness eroded by whatever demons drove him to the bottom of a bottle, day after day. In his meaty fist, he gripped a length of rope attached to a collar around the neck of what had once been a beautiful dog. The animal was a mixed breed, part shepherd by the look of him, with intelligent brown eyes that held too much understanding of human cruelty. His coat, which should have been golden brown and white, was matted with dirt and dried blood. Fresh wounds marked his flanks and sides, the evidence of systematic abuse that made Ezra's jaw tighten with familiar anger. "Worthless cur," Silas slurred, jerking the rope hard enough to send the dog tumbling across the dusty street. "Should have drowned you when you were a pup." He aimed a kick at the animal's ribs, connecting with a sickening thud that echoed in the evening quiet. The dog tried to scramble away, but the rope around his neck held him fast. His whimper cut through the air like a blade, and Ezra felt something shift inside his chest, the same protective instinct that had driven him to become a medic, the same compulsion that had made him volunteer for the most dangerous assignments during the war. But this wasn't the war, and Ezra had learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's troubles usually meant taking on more than you bargained for. He forced himself to continue toward the livery stable, even as the sounds of continued abuse followed him down the street. Behind him, Silas Grady delivered one final vicious kick to his dog's ribs before dropping the rope and stumbling back toward the saloon. "Stay there and rot," he snarled over his shoulder. "Maybe the coyotes will do me a favor and finish you off." The blood-stained collar around the dog's neck told its own story of systematic cruelty, the leather worn thin from constant pulling and marked with tooth impressions where the animal had tried, unsuccessfully, to free himself. It would become, in time, a symbol of survival against impossible odds, but for now, it was simply evidence of one man's capacity for senseless brutality. As darkness settled over Copper Ridge, like a familiar blanket, the dog lay motionless in the street, his breathing shallow and labored. The townspeople who might have helped had long since learned that interfering with Silas Grady's business was a mistake that could cost them more than they were willing to pay. But sometimes, when the right person comes along at exactly the right moment, the whole course of a story can change with a single act of compassion. Ezra couldn't sleep. He'd taken a room at Murphy's boarding house, eaten Martha's stew, and tried to settle into the routine of another anonymous night in another forgettable town. But the image of that beaten dog wouldn't leave him alone, and the sound of its whimper echoed in his mind like a prayer he couldn't answer. At 2 a.m, he gave up the pretense of rest and dressed quietly in the darkness. The boarding house creaked around him as he made his way downstairs and out into the cool night air. Copper Ridge slept under a blanket of stars, the only sounds the distant howl of a coyote and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. The dog lay exactly where Silas had left him, curled into a tight ball of pain in the middle of the street. Moonlight revealed the extent of his injuries, fresh cuts layered over older scars, ribs that moved wrong when he breathed, and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of a creature that had given up hope. Ezra knelt beside the animal, moving slowly and speaking in the soft tones he'd learned to use with wounded soldiers. "Easy there, boy. Let me take a look at you." The dog lifted his head with tremendous effort, and Ezra was struck by the intelligence in those brown eyes. This wasn't some wild animal or mindless beast. This was a companion who'd once known kindness, who remembered what it felt like to be loved. The realization made Silas Grady's cruelty even more inexcusable. With practiced hands, Ezra assessed the damage. 2 broken ribs, multiple lacerations, signs of malnutrition, and what appeared to be an old injury to the left hind leg that had healed poorly. It was a miracle the animal was still alive, let alone conscious. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Ezra murmured, gently examining the blood-stained collar. The leather was old but well made, with intricate tooling that suggested it had once belonged to someone who cared about such details. Strange, it didn't seem like the sort of thing a man like Silas would have chosen. The dog made no attempt to bite or struggle as Ezra lifted him carefully, supporting his weight to avoid putting pressure on the damaged ribs. For an animal that had every reason to mistrust human touch, his docility was heartbreaking. He'd been broken so thoroughly that even gentle handling surprised him. Back in his room, Ezra spread a blanket on the floor and laid the dog down with infinite care. From his saddlebags, he retrieved the medical supplies that had traveled with him across half the territory's bandages, laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for cleaning wounds, and a small sewing kit for sutures. "This is going to hurt," he warned softly, "but it's got to be done." For the next 3 hours, Ezra worked by lamplight to clean and dress the dog's wounds. The animal bore the treatment with stoic silence, occasionally lifting his head to watch Ezra's face, as if trying to understand why this stranger was showing him kindness. As dawn broke over Copper Ridge, the dog was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, his breathing deeper and more regular. Ezra sat in the room's single chair, exhausted but oddly satisfied. It felt good to use his skills for healing again, to remember why he'd become a medic in the first place. Over the next few days, the dog's recovery progressed with remarkable speed. His natural constitution was strong, and once given proper care and regular food, his body began to repair itself. More importantly, his spirit began to return. The wariness never completely left his eyes, but he started to show flashes of the personality that had survived Silas Grady's brutality. He was intelligent, extraordinarily so. Within hours of regaining his strength, he'd figured out how to open the simple latch on Ezra's door. He seemed to understand complex instructions and showed an uncanny ability to read human emotions. When Ezra was frustrated or sad, the dog would rest his head on his knee with the patient wisdom of a counselor. "You're no ordinary mutt, are you?" Ezra asked one evening, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Makes me wonder how you ended up with a bastard like Grady." The dog's response was to stand and move toward the window, his posture suddenly alert and focused. He whined softly, a sound entirely different from the pain-filled cries Ezra had first heard. This was purposeful, insistent, almost like he was trying to communicate something specific. Curious, Ezra opened the window. The dog immediately put his front paws on the sill and began making soft noises while looking toward a specific spot behind the saloon. His body language was unmistakable. He wanted to go somewhere, and he wanted Ezra to follow. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" The next morning, Ezra decided to satisfy his curiosity. The dog was strong enough for gentle exercise, and his insistent behavior suggested there was something important he needed to show. They slipped out of the boarding house before dawn, the dog leading with surprising confidence despite his recent injuries. Behind Martha's saloon, in a patch of scrubby ground where the town's refuse was usually dumped, the dog began digging with his good front paw. He worked with focused intensity, occasionally looking up at Ezra, as if to make sure he was paying attention. "What have you found there?" Ezra knelt beside the dog and helped clear away the loose dirt and debris. His fingers encountered something hard and smooth metal, A few more minutes of careful excavation revealed a silver pocket watch, its surface tarnished but still elegant. The initials SC were engraved on the case in flowing script, and the back bore an inscription, "To Samuel, with all my love, Maria, 1878. Ezra had heard that name before. Samuel Cortez had been a traveling merchant who'd passed through Copper Ridge about 6 months earlier. He'd been found dead on the road outside of town, apparently the victim of robbery. His wagon had been stripped bare, his horses stolen, and his body left for the scavengers. Sheriff Murphy had investigated, but without witnesses or substantial evidence, the case had gone cold. The dog watched intently as Ezra examined the watch, his tail giving a tentative wag when he saw recognition in the man's eyes. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something that looked remarkably like satisfaction, as if he'd finally managed to deliver an important message. "How did you know this was here?" Ezra asked softly. "And more importantly, how did you know I needed to see it?" The implications were staggering. If the dog had buried this watch, it meant he'd been present when Samuel Cortez died. It meant he'd witnessed what really happened to the traveling merchant. And if Silas Grady had been involved, it explained why the animal had been beaten so severely. A witness, even a four-legged one, could be inconvenient for a murderer. Ezra looked down at the dog, who was now sitting at his feet with an expression of patient expectation. "You saw what happened to Cortez, didn't you? And Grady's been trying to shut you up ever since." The dog's tail wagged once, deliberately, and Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. He'd stumbled into something far more serious than simple animal abuse. He was looking at evidence of murder, and his four-legged companion might be the only witness who could identify the killer. As they walked back toward town, Ezra's mind raced with the implications. He'd wanted to avoid getting involved in local troubles, but circumstances seemed determined to drag him into the middle of something dark and dangerous. The dog beside him moved with new purpose, his head held high despite his healing injuries. Whatever secrets lay buried in Copper Ridge, Ezra suspected he'd only uncovered the tip of something much larger and more sinister. The question was whether he had the courage to keep digging, and whether he could keep both himself and his newfound companion alive long enough to see justice done. 0.5. The Silver Dollar Saloon held the comfortable hum of evening conversation when Ezra pushed through the batwing doors, the dog at his side moving with careful but determined steps. Martha looked up from wiping down glasses, her steel-grey eyes noting the animal's improved condition with approval. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, setting down her rag. "That's the same dog Silas was kicking around a week ago, isn't it? Looks like a different animal entirely." "Good food and decent treatment can work miracles," Ezra replied, settling onto a stool at the bar. The dog positioned himself beside Ezra's chair, alert but no longer cowering at the sound of human voices. Martha poured 2 fingers of whiskey without being asked. "Name's Justice, by the way. Heard him called that once, back when he first showed up with Grady. Always struck me as ironic, considering." "Justice." Ezra tested the name, and the dog's ears perked up in recognition. "Fits him better now than it probably did then." "Lot of things in this town could use a dose of justice," Martha said quietly, glancing toward the corner table where Sheriff Murphy sat nursing his nightly bottle. The lawman had the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd stopped believing in his own authority. Ezra pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest, setting it carefully on the bar. "Ever see this before?" Martha's expression shifted from casual interest to sharp attention. She picked up the watch, examining the inscription with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read people and situations quickly. "Samuel Cortez, that poor merchant who got himself killed on the road last spring." "Got himself killed?" Ezra kept his voice neutral, but Justice's ears flattened slightly at Martha's words. "Bad choice of words," Martha corrected herself. "Man was murdered, robbed of everything he carried. Murphy investigated, but you know how these things go. No witnesses, no evidence. Case goes cold." She set the watch down carefully. "Where did you find this?" Justice found it, buried behind your place. Martha's eyes widened slightly. That dog found it? How would he know where to look unless... She stopped, the implications settling in her mind like stones dropping into still water. Unless he saw what really happened, Ezra finished. Unless he witnessed the murder and knew where the evidence was hidden. Before Martha could respond, the saloon doors swung open again. Silas Grady stumbled in, already deep in his cups despite the relatively early hour. His bloodshot eyes swept the room and fixed on Justice with immediate recognition and rage. "What the hell is that worthless mutt doing in here?" he snarled, starting toward their table with the dangerous instability of a drunk looking for trouble. Justice didn't cower this time. Instead, he moved to place himself between Silas and Ezra, his hackles rising slightly, but his posture controlled. The transformation was remarkable. This was no longer a beaten animal, but a dog with purpose and protection to offer. "Easy, Grady," Martha said, her voice carrying the authority that kept her establishment peaceful. "Dog's not bothering anyone." "That's my property," Silas spat, reaching for Justice's collar. "Belonged to that Mexican merchant, but I kept him when the man didn't need him anymore." Ezra's blood went cold at the casual admission, but he kept his expression neutral. Mexican merchant? Cortez, or whatever his name was, found his wagon on the road, horses scattered, driver dead as a doornail. Kept the dog as payment for my trouble in reporting the whole mess. Silas's laugh was ugly, edged with the kind of cruelty that enjoyed causing pain. "Generous of you to take on a stray," Ezra said mildly, but his hand rested on Justice's head in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. Wasn't generous, was practical. Dog knew things, saw things he shouldn't have seen. Figured I'd keep him close, make sure he didn't go wandering around where he didn't belong. Silas's eyes were clearer now, and Ezra realized the man wasn't as drunk as he appeared. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Martha's face had gone pale, and even Sheriff Murphy was looking up from his bottle with something approaching interest. Justice pressed closer to Ezra's leg, his body tense with barely contained emotion. "Well," Ezra said carefully, "seems like he's found where he belongs now." Silas's expression darkened further. "Dog belongs to me. Been feeding him, housing him, taking care of him for months. You got no right to interfere with a man's property." "Funny thing about taking care of him," Martha interjected, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "Most folks don't use boots and fists as part of their animal husbandry." "How I discipline my animals is my business," Silas growled. "And I'll thank you to keep your opinions to yourself, woman." The saloon had gone quiet, the kind of expectant silence that precedes either violence or revelation. Ezra could feel the weight of multiple gazes, could sense the town holding its breath to see how this confrontation would play out. "Tell you what," Ezra said, reaching into his pocket. "I'll buy him from you. What's a half-dead dog worth these days?" Silas's eyes narrowed with suspicion and greed. $50. It was an outrageous price for any dog, let alone one that had been systematically abused. But Ezra had learned that sometimes the best way to avoid a fight was to give your opponent exactly what they thought they wanted. "Deal." He counted out the bills and placed them on the bar. "But I want a bill of sale, something that makes the transfer legal and binding." Martha produced paper and pen with the efficiency of someone who'd mediated countless transactions. Silas signed his name with the careful concentration of a man who didn't write often, his greed overcoming whatever caution might have warned him against making the sale. As soon as the ink was dry, Ezra folded the bill of sale and tucked it into his vest pocket. Justice seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed his tail, wagged once, tentatively, and he looked up at Ezra with an expression that might have been gratitude. "Pleasure doing business with you, Grady," Ezra said, raising his glass in a mock toast. Silas pocketed the money and turned toward the door, but not before delivering a parting shot that chilled everyone who heard it. "Hope you know what you're getting yourself into, stranger. That dog's got a way of leading folks into trouble. Last man who owned him found that out the hard way." After Silas left, the saloon slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the tension remained. Martha refilled Ezra's glass without being asked, her movements sharp with suppressed anger. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said quietly. "Probably both," Ezra admitted. "But I couldn't let him keep beating on justice, and after what I just heard, you think Silas killed Cortez?" Ezra glanced around the saloon, noting who was within earshot. "I think justice knows more about what happened than anyone realizes, and I think there are people in this town who'd rather keep certain secrets buried." Later that evening, alone in his room, Ezra examined the torn wanted poster he'd found tucked behind a loose board in his window frame. The paper was partially destroyed, deliberately torn to remove key information, but enough remained to show it had been a notice seeking information about the Cortez murder. Someone had taken great care to ensure this particular piece of evidence disappeared from public view. The question was, who and what else they might be willing to do to keep the truth hidden. Justice lay on his makeshift bed, watching Ezra with the patient attention of a dog who'd learned to read human moods and intentions. His recovery was remarkable, but more than his physical healing, his transformation from broken victim to purposeful companion suggested depths of intelligence and loyalty that Silas Grady had never bothered to recognize. "What do you think, boy?" Ezra asked softly. "Are we in over our heads?" Justice's tail thumped once against the floor, not quite agreement, but acknowledgement that they were committed to whatever came next. Together, they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Ezra suspected their real troubles were just beginning. Doc Harwell's clinic occupied a narrow building between the general store and the barber shop, its windows facing east to catch the morning light that was essential for delicate medical work. When Ezra arrived with Justice at his side, he found the physician grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, the rhythmic scraping providing a steady counterpoint to their conversation. "Never seen a dog recover that quickly from injuries like those," Doc said, glancing at Justice who lay quietly beside Ezra's chair. "Whatever you did, it worked. More than worked, it's like he's become a different animal entirely. Clean wounds, proper nutrition, and no more beatings," Ezra replied. "Amazing what basic kindness can accomplish when someone's been systematically brutalized." Doc set down his pestle and wiped his hands on his apron. He was quiet for a long moment, studying Ezra with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read between the lines of what his patients told him. Years of frontier medicine had taught him that sometimes the most important truths were the ones people hesitated to speak aloud. "You're not just here to discuss veterinary medicine," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen enough of human nature to recognize when deeper currents were flowing beneath calm surfaces. Ezra pulled out the silver pocket watch, placing it carefully on Doc's examination table where the morning light caught its tarnished surface. "Justice led me to this. Found it buried behind Martha's place, like he knew exactly where to look." Doc picked up the watch with the gentle precision he used when handling delicate instruments, his expression growing troubled as he read the inscription. The elegant script seemed to mock the violent circumstances that had separated it from its owner. "Samuel Cortez. I remember him well, came through town last spring with a wagon full of goods to trade. Pleasant fellow, soft-spoken, clearly devoted to his family." He looked up sharply, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. He spoke often about his wife Maria and their children waiting for him in California. Said this would be his last trading run before settling down permanently. "This was buried behind Martha's saloon," Ezra said quietly. "Justice knew where to find it, which means he was there when it was hidden. The question is, how did Cortez's watch end up buried in Copper Ridge when he was supposedly killed by road agents miles outside of town?" Doc Harwell sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 60-odd years. The weight of realization was settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Are you suggesting Samuel was Cortez, wasn't killed where Sheriff Murphy claims he found the body?" I'm suggesting that justice witnessed something the night Cortez died, something that certain people would prefer stay buried along with this watch. Ezra leaned forward, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the clinic. And I think there might be more than one victim we don't know about. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on Doc's wall, each second marking time that might be running out for all of them. Finally, the physician sighed deeply and opened a locked drawer in his desk, withdrawing a small, leather-bound journal tied with string. "I keep records," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just medical records, but observations. Things I've noticed that don't quite add up, patterns that trouble a man who spent 40 years learning to read the signs of violence and deception." He opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon, revealing neat handwriting that documented far more than medical treatments. Samuel Cortez wasn't the first traveling merchant to die on the roads around here. In the past 2 years, I count at least 4 similar cases, maybe more. All found stripped of their goods, all apparently killed by unknown assailants, all discovered in locations that seemed convenient for whoever found them. Ezra studied the careful notations in Doc's handwriting, seeing names, dates, and circumstances of discovery that painted a troubling picture. Each entry represented not just a life lost, but a family somewhere wondering what had happened to their loved one. "These cases," Ezra said, running his finger down the list, "were they all investigated by Sheriff Murphy, after a fashion? But Murphy's been different lately, distracted, reluctant to pursue certain lines of inquiry that might lead to uncomfortable truths." Doc's voice carried the disappointment of a man who'd once respected the sheriff's integrity. "There are rumors about payments being made to ensure certain investigations don't dig too deep." "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that get people hurt if they talk too openly about them. The kind that suggest corruption reaches higher than anyone wants to admit." Doc closed the journal carefully, as if the information inside was too dangerous to leave exposed. "But if what you're suggesting is true, if justice was present when Samuel Cortez was murdered, then we're dealing with something much bigger than simple road banditry." The clinic door opened with its familiar chime, and Martha entered carrying a covered basket that filled the room with the warm scent of fresh bread and coffee. She took one look at their serious expressions and the open evidence on Doc's desk, and her face tightened with the understanding of someone who'd learned to read dangerous situations quickly. "Discussing the recent troubles with travelers?" she asked, setting the basket down and glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Among other things," Ezra replied carefully. "Doc's been filling me in on some of the unfortunate incidents we've had in the past couple of years." Martha pulled up a chair, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "If we're talking about unfortunate incidents that don't quite add up, there's something I need to tell you both. Something I've kept quiet about for too long." She reached into her apron and withdrew a small metal object wrapped in faded cloth, a military medal on a worn ribbon that had once been bright blue. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing the bronze star that represented sacrifice and honor. "This belonged to my father," she said, her voice thick with emotion that had been suppressed for years. "Captain Miguel Cordova, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. The army told me he died in an Indian raid during his final tour of duty, but that was a lie. He died right here in Copper Ridge, and his death wasn't random violence. It was murder." Doc leaned forward with interest, his medical instincts engaging. "I remember your father. Treated him for a knife wound about a week before he died. He said he'd been jumped by road agents, but something about his story didn't ring true. The wound was too precise, too deliberate, more like an assassination attempt than a robbery gone wrong." "Because that's exactly what it was," Martha said flatly, her grief hardening into anger. "My father had discovered who was stealing army supplies and selling them to the highest bidder, regardless of whether the buyers were outlaws, Indians, or Mexican revolutionaries. He'd gathered evidence, names, documentation of the entire operation. She paused, looking down at the medal as if it could somehow channel her father's strength. The knife wound you treated was from his first attempt to silence him. When that failed, they tried again. The second attempt succeeded. Ezra felt justice shift beside him. The dog's attention focused intently on Martha, as if he understood the importance of what she was revealing. There was something in the animal's posture that suggested recognition, as if Martha's story connected to memories of his own. "Who killed him?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The same man who's been killing travelers for the past 2 years. The same man who probably killed Samuel Cortez and tried to silence the only witness who could identify him." Martha's eyes hardened with resolve. Silas Grady didn't start out as a random drunk who beats animals. He was a soldier once, dishonorably discharged for theft and violence. But he's not working alone. He's got protection, people in positions of authority who make sure his crimes go unpunished. "Sheriff Murphy," Doc said, his voice heavy with disappointment and growing understanding. "Murphy's just one of them. There are others, people with influence who benefit from keeping certain truths buried." Martha reached over and scratched behind Justice's ears, her touch gentle, despite the steel in her voice. "But this dog represents something they can't control. He's living proof that their secrets aren't as safe as they thought." As if summoned by their conversation about corruption, the clinic door opened again to admit Sheriff Murphy himself. The lawman looked haggard, his badge tarnished, and his gun belt sitting awkwardly on his expanding waistline. His eyes took in the 3 conspirators, and the evidence spread across Doc's examination table with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a threat. "Afternoon, folks," Murphy said, his voice carrying a warning beneath its casual tone. "Heard there was some kind of disturbance at the Silver Dollar last night. Something about a disagreement over a dog that got out of hand." "No disturbance at all," Martha replied smoothly, her saloon-keeper's instincts helping her project calm authority. "Just a simple business transaction. Ezra here bought justice from Silas Grady, fair and square. Got the bill of sale to prove it, all legal and proper." Murphy's gaze fixed on Justice, who met the sheriff's stare without flinching. There was something in the lawman's expression, recognition perhaps, or fear of what the animal might represent to people asking inconvenient questions. "That's good," Murphy said slowly, his words carefully measured. "Good to know there's no ongoing dispute. Wouldn't want any complications arising from misunderstandings about ownership or past associations." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Murphy was warning them to let sleeping dogs lie, to avoid stirring up old cases that had been deliberately closed. His message was clear: continue this investigation and face the consequences. "No complications at all," Ezra assured him, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "Justice seems perfectly happy with his new situation. In fact, he's shown remarkable improvement since leaving his previous owner's care." After Murphy left, the 3 sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the implications of what had just occurred. The sheriff's visit hadn't been coincidental. Someone had reported their activities, and the message had been delivered with the efficiency of a well-organized conspiracy. Finally, Martha spoke what they were all thinking. "We're in real danger now, all of us. Once word gets out that we're asking questions, connecting dots that were supposed to stay unconnected, they'll have to act to protect themselves. Then maybe it's time to take the initiative," Ezra said quietly, his hand resting protectively on Justice's head. "Instead of waiting for them to come to us, maybe we should start gathering evidence that can't be ignored or covered up by corrupt officials." Doc closed his journal and locked it back in his drawer with movements that suggested this might be the last time he could safely access his documentation. "What kind of evidence are you thinking about?" "The kind that justice can provide. He's already shown me where one piece of evidence was hidden. I'm willing to bet he knows where to find more things that Grady and his accomplices thought were safely buried. As if understanding his crucial role in their plans, Justice stood and moved to the clinic door, his posture alert and purposeful. He looked back at Ezra with an expression that seemed to say he was ready to continue their investigation, ready to finally seek justice for all the crimes he'd witnessed. Outside, the sun was setting over Copper Ridge, casting long shadows that seemed to hold more menace than usual. Somewhere in those shadows, men were making plans to protect their secrets at any cost, drawing up lists of people who knew too much and posed too great a threat to their carefully constructed empire. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd underestimated the power of truth when it was backed by courage, and they'd failed to account for the loyalty of a dog who'd survived their worst cruelties and lived to bear witness against them. The military medal lay on the table between them, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Martha's father had died trying to expose corruption and protect innocent people from predators in uniform. Now his daughter and her allies faced the same choice: remain silent and safe, or speak truth to power and accept the consequences. Justice's presence beside them was both comfort and challenge, a living reminder that justice delayed was often justice denied, but that persistence and loyalty could eventually triumph over even the most entrenched systems of corruption and violence. 0.5. 3 days after their conversation in Doc Harwell's clinic, Justice began exhibiting new behavior that both intrigued and concerned Ezra. The dog would sit by the window of their boarding house room for hours, his attention fixed on something in the distance that Ezra couldn't identify. When they walked through town, Justice would pause at seemingly random locations, his nose working the air with the intensity of a bloodhound following a scent trail. It was during one of these walks that Justice led Ezra to an abandoned shack on the outskirts of town. The building had once been a prospector's cabin, but years of neglect had reduced it to little more than 4 walls and a partially collapsed roof. Justice circled the structure twice before settling beside a particular section of the back wall, his behavior indicating this was what he'd been searching for. Ezra examined the area carefully, noting the way the ground had been disturbed, despite attempts to disguise the digging. Using a broken piece of wood as a makeshift shovel, he began excavating the soft earth. What he found made his blood run cold. The leather-bound ledger was wrapped in oilcloth, its pages protected from moisture, but still bearing the stains of hasty concealment. The handwriting inside was meticulous, recording transactions that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching far beyond Copper Ridge. Names, dates, amounts, all carefully documented in what appeared to be Silas Grady's surprisingly neat script. The entries revealed payments to Sheriff Murphy, but also to county officials, territorial judges, and even representatives of major trading companies. The corruption wasn't just local, it was part of a network that stretched across Montana territory, protecting criminals in exchange for a percentage of their profits. More disturbing were the coded references to packages and deliveries that clearly referred to murdered travelers. Samuel Cortez was listed as Package C7, delivered spring 1883, contents distributed per arrangement. The clinical language made Ezra's stomach turn, reducing human lives to mere business transactions. But most shocking of all was the signature at the bottom of several pages, not Silas Grady's crude scrawl, but the educated hand of someone with far more authority and influence. The name J. Rawlings appeared repeatedly, along with notations about territorial expansion and future opportunities. Jake Rawlings, Ezra murmured, recognizing the name. Rawlings was rumored to control illegal activities across 3 counties, a man with enough legitimate business interests to provide cover for his criminal enterprises. If Silas Grady was working for Rawlings, then they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple murderous drunk. Justice watched intently as Ezra studied the ledger, occasionally whining softly when certain pages were turned. The dog seemed to understand the significance of what they'd discovered, and his agitation increased with each revelation of the conspiracy's scope. Back in town, Ezra found Martha closing the silver dollar for the evening. She took one look at his expression and immediately ushered him into the back room, where they could speak privately. "What did you find?" she asked without preamble. Ezra spread the ledger open on her kitchen table, watching her face change as she absorbed the implications of what she was reading. The color drained from her cheeks when she reached the entries about her father's death, recorded with the same cold efficiency as the other murders. "They killed him for $50, she whispered, her voice breaking. "My father died for $50 and a promise to keep quiet about stolen weapons. This goes much deeper than we thought," Ezra said gently. "Grady's just muscle for hire. The real power behind this is Jake Rawlings, and he's got people in his pocket all the way up to the territorial government." Martha closed the ledger with shaking hands. "What do we do with this? If we take it to Sheriff Murphy, he'll destroy it and probably kill us in the process. If we try to contact territorial authorities, there's no way to know who else is compromised." Before Ezra could answer, they heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast through the main street. Martha extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "6 men," she reported quietly, "armed and looking for trouble. I don't recognize most of them, but that's definitely Jake Rawlings leading the group." Ezra felt Justice press against his leg, the dog's body tense with alertness. Through the dim light filtering through the curtains, he could see Rawlings, a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His companions had the hard look of professional gunmen, the kind of men who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. The riders stopped in front of the silver dollar, and Rawlings dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who owned whatever ground he chose to stand on. His voice carried clearly through the evening air as he addressed his men. "Grady says there's a stranger asking questions about old business. Says this stranger's got the Cortez dog and might have found things that were supposed to stay buried." Rawlings adjusted his gun belt with the practiced motion of someone who'd drawn his weapon in anger more than once. "I want to have a conversation with this stranger. A private conversation." Martha grabbed Ezra's arm, her grip tight with fear. "There's a back way out through the kitchen. If you leave now, you might be able to reach the livery stable before they think to check there. What about you?" "I'll be fine. They have no reason to suspect I'm involved." Her voice was steady, but Ezra could see the lie in her eyes. If Rawlings was thorough in his investigation, it wouldn't take long to connect Martha to their inquiries. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," Ezra said firmly. "Then we need another plan." Martha moved away from the window, thinking quickly. "The old mine shaft behind the cemetery, it connects to a tunnel system that runs under half the town. My late husband used to hide contraband there during his smuggling days." The sound of boots on the saloon's front porch indicated their time for planning was running out. Justice's hackles were raised, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. The dog sensed the approaching danger as clearly as his human companions. "Go," Martha whispered urgently. "Take Justice and the ledger. I'll stall them as long as I can." "Martha, this is what my father would have wanted. Someone to finally stand up to these bastards and make them pay for what they've done." She pressed a key into his hand. "This opens the door to the mine shaft. Follow the main tunnel east for about a quarter mile, then take the left fork. It'll bring you out near Doc Harwell's place." Ezra pocketed the key and tucked the ledger inside his jacket. Justice was already moving toward the back door, his instincts telling him it was time to leave. As they slipped out into the darkness, Ezra heard the saloon's front door open and Rawlings's voice asking Martha if she'd seen a stranger with a dog. The cemetery was shrouded in mist, rising from the creek that ran along its eastern border. Ancient headstones stood like silent sentinels, marking the lives of those who'd found their final rest in Copper Ridge's rocky soil. Justice led the way between the graves, with sure-footed confidence, his night vision far superior to Ezra's. The mine shaft entrance was hidden behind a weathered mausoleum, its iron door nearly invisible in the darkness. The key Martha had given him turned easily, and soon they were descending into the earth through tunnels carved by hopeful prospectors decades earlier. The underground passages were a maze of intersecting shafts and abandoned workings, but Justice seemed to know where they were going. The dog's behavior suggested he'd been in these tunnels before, perhaps following his previous owner on clandestine business, or maybe hiding here during the worst of Silas Grady's abuse. As they navigated the darkness, guided only by the faint gleam of phosphorescent minerals in the rock walls, Ezra reflected on how quickly his simple act of compassion had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. He'd come to Copper Ridge as a drifter seeking anonymity, but circumstance and conscience had drawn him into a fight that could well cost him his life. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness above, Jake Rawlings and his men were searching for evidence that could destroy their carefully constructed empire of corruption and violence. The ledger in Ezra's jacket represented years of meticulous record-keeping, but it also represented hope-proof that justice was possible even in a place where it had been systematically subverted for so long. Justice paused at a junction in the tunnels, his ears pricked forward as he listened for sounds from the surface. After a moment, he chose the left passage, leading them deeper into the earth and closer to whatever sanctuary Doc Harwell's proximity might provide. They were committed now to a course of action that would either expose the truth or get them all killed in the attempt. The tunnel emerged behind Doc Harwell's clinic through a concealed entrance that had been skillfully disguised as part of the building's stone foundation. Justice scratched at a particular section of the wall, and when Ezra felt around the area, he discovered a hidden latch that opened a narrow doorway just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Doc Harwell was waiting for them in his darkened clinic, having heard the commotion in town and correctly guessed where they might seek refuge. His face was grim as he helped them through the concealed entrance and quickly sealed it behind them. "Rawlings has 6 men with him," Doc reported quietly. "They've torn Martha's place apart, looking for you and that ledger. When they didn't find what they wanted, they started asking pointed questions about who you've been talking to. Is Martha safe?" "For now, but they've got her under guard at the jail, claiming she's being held for her own protection while they investigate threats against her business." Doc's expression darkened. "It's a thin pretense, and it won't hold for long if they don't find what they're looking for." Ezra pulled the leather-bound ledger from his jacket and spread it open on Doc's examination table. "They're looking for this. It documents everything: the murders, the corruption, the network of officials taking bribes to look the other way." Doc studied the pages with the careful attention he usually reserved for medical texts. His face grew increasingly troubled as he read the methodical documentation of crime and conspiracy. "This is comprehensive enough to bring down half the territorial government," he said finally, "but it's also comprehensive enough to get everyone who's seen it killed before we can get it to honest authorities." "Assuming we can find any honest authorities," Ezra replied grimly. "There's one possibility." Doc moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with string. "I correspond with a federal marshal named Thomas Crawford. He's based in Helena, but his jurisdiction covers the entire territory. More importantly, he's got a reputation for being incorruptible." Justice had positioned himself near the clinic's front window, his body alert for any sign of approaching danger. The dog's enhanced senses made him an invaluable early warning system, but his tension also served as a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. "Even if we could get word to this marshal, how do we know Rawlings doesn't have people watching the telegraph office, the mail routes, every way of communicating with the outside world?" "We don't," Doc admitted, "but we have to try something. We can't hide in these tunnels forever, and Martha's life depends on us exposing this conspiracy before Rawlings decides she's too dangerous to keep alive." A soft scratching at the hidden entrance interrupted their conversation. Doc moved cautiously to the concealed door and listened carefully before opening it to admit a figure dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled up to obscure their features. "Thank God you made it safely," the newcomer said, pulling back the hood to reveal Martha's face. "I told them I needed to use the privy, then slipped out through the old smuggler's route my husband showed me years ago. How did you get away from Rawlings's men?" "Sheriff Murphy's not as thorough as he used to be, especially when he's been drinking. The guard he posted dozed off around midnight." Martha's smile was grim. "I left him sleeping peacefully, but it won't be long before they discover I'm gone." "Then we need to move quickly," Ezra said. "Doc thinks we can get word to a federal marshal in Helena, but we need a way to communicate that Rawlings can't intercept." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "There might be a way. My late husband had connections throughout the territory, people who owed him favors from his smuggling days. Some of them are still around, still moving goods through channels the authorities don't monitor." "What kind of goods?" "Whatever needs to be transported discreetly. Messages, small packages, sometimes people who need to disappear for a while." Martha's expression was serious. "It's dangerous, and it's expensive, but it works." Doc was already writing a letter, his pen moving quickly across the paper as he summarized their situation and the evidence they'd discovered. "Marshal Crawford will need to see the original ledger, but this should be enough to get his attention and bring him to Copper Ridge." As Doc wrote, Justice's behavior became increasingly agitated. The dog moved from window to window, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. Finally, he returned to Ezra's side and gave a soft whine, their agreed-upon signal that danger was approaching. "They're coming," Ezra said quietly. Doc quickly finished his letter and handed it to Martha, along with a small pouch of coins. "Can your contact get this to Helena without Rawlings knowing?" "If anyone can, it's Samuel Two Bears. He runs goods through the high passes, where the territorial police never patrol." Martha tucked the letter into her bodice. "But it'll take at least a week for the message to reach Crawford and another week for him to get here." "We might not have 2 weeks," Ezra pointed out. "Then we'll have to find a way to stay alive until help arrives." The sound of horses outside confirmed Justice's warning. Through the clinic's front window, they could see torches moving through the streets as Rawlings's men conducted a methodical search of every building in town. It wouldn't be long before they reached Doc's clinic. "Back through the tunnels," Doc whispered urgently. "There's another exit near the old church. From there, you can reach the abandoned homestead on Miller's Creek. It's isolated enough to hide in for a few days." As they prepared to leave through the hidden entrance, Ezra found himself confronting a moment of doubt that had been building since this adventure began. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew his father's service revolver, the weight of the weapon familiar and troubling in his hands. The Colt had belonged to Captain William Kane, who'd carried it through 3 years of Civil War combat before passing it to his son with the admonition that violence should always be a last resort. Ezra had avoided using the weapon during his years of drifting, relying instead on his medical skills and his ability to avoid trouble. But trouble had found him anyway, and the luxury of avoiding violence was rapidly disappearing. The men hunting them weren't interested in negotiation or compromise. They were willing to commit murder to protect their secrets, and they demonstrated that innocent life meant nothing to them. "I've spent years trying to heal instead of harm," Ezra said quietly, checking the revolver's cylinder. "But some situations can't be healed with medicine." Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "My father used to say that sometimes you have to be willing to fight evil, even if fighting goes against your nature. The alternative is to let evil win." Justice pressed close to Ezra's leg, offering the silent support of a companion who'd already endured the worst that evil men could inflict. The dog's presence was a reminder that some fights were worth having, that justice sometimes required those who could stand up to do so. Outside, the search was growing closer. Shouted orders and the sound of doors being kicked in indicated that Rawlings's patience was wearing thin. Soon they would reach the clinic, and the flimsy pretense of a legal investigation would give way to the brutal efficiency of men who solved problems with violence. "Time to go," Doc whispered, opening the hidden entrance. As they descended once again into the darkness of the tunnels, Ezra reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that evening when he'd found a beaten dog lying in Copper Ridge's dusty street. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into something much larger, a stand against corruption and cruelty that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone in the territory who believed that justice was possible. Behind them, the sounds of the search grew more urgent. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility that their fight for truth might cost them everything they held dear. But justice trotted beside him with unwavering loyalty, and Ezra knew that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. The abandoned homestead on Miller's Creek had been empty for 3 years, ever since drought and grasshopper plagues drove the Sullivan family back east. The house was little more than a shell, 4 walls, a partially collapsed roof, and windows that let in more wind than they kept out. But it was isolated enough to provide temporary refuge while they waited for word from Marshal Crawford. Ezra was checking the perimeter for signs of recent visitors when Justice began exhibiting behavior he'd never seen before. The dog moved through the ruins of the homestead with purpose, his nose working the ground as if following a specific scent trail. But this wasn't the casual investigation of a curious animal. This was the focused search of someone looking for something particular. "What is it, boy?" Ezra asked, following Justice toward what had once been the family's bedroom. Justice pawed at a section of the wooden floor where the boards didn't quite align properly. When Ezra knelt to examine the area more closely, he discovered that several planks had been carefully cut and could be lifted to reveal a hidden space beneath. Inside the makeshift hiding place was a collection of personal belongings that made Ezra's blood run cold. A woman's wedding ring, a child's wooden toy, a man's pocket watch, all items that belonged to people who should have taken them when they moved away, unless they'd never had the chance to pack. But it was the family photograph that stopped Ezra's heart entirely. The image showed a young Mexican couple with 2 small children, the man's arm protectively around his wife's shoulders, while the children smiled shyly at the camera. In the corner of the photograph was a dog, Justice, though younger and healthier than when Ezra had first found him. "This is your family," Ezra whispered, looking at Justice with new understanding. "The Cortez family. Samuel wasn't just a traveling merchant, he was your owner. And these children—" Justice whimpered softly, pressing his nose against the photograph. The dog's entire body was trembling, not with fear but with a grief so profound it was almost human in its intensity. Martha, who had been examining the rest of the hiding place, pulled out a leather portfolio tied with string. Inside were official documents, deeds, birth certificates, letters from relatives that told the complete story of the Cortez family's tragic end. Samuel and Maria Cortez weren't just passing through Copper Ridge, Martha said, her voice heavy with the weight of revelation. They were planning to settle here permanently. Samuel had purchased land from the territorial government, and they were traveling with everything they owned, their life savings, family heirlooms, everything they needed to start over. Doc Harwell studied a letter written in Spanish, his limited knowledge of the language sufficient to understand its basic contents. "This is from Maria's brother, in California. He's asking when they plan to arrive for the birth of their 3rd child. The letter is dated 6 months after Samuel's supposed death." The implications were staggering. The Cortez family hadn't been random victims of road agents, they'd been specifically targeted because of their wealth and their plans to establish themselves in the territory. Silas Grady and Jake Rawlings had murdered an entire family, stolen everything they owned, and left Justice as the sole survivor of the massacre. "But if the whole family was killed," Ezra said slowly, "why did the official report only mention Samuel? What happened to Maria and the children?" Justice moved to another section of the hidden floor and began pawing at the boards with increasing desperation. This time, when Ezra lifted the planks, he found something that made his stomach turn: children's clothing, carefully folded and stained with what could only be blood. "They killed them all," Martha whispered, her voice breaking. "The entire family, even the children. And then they covered it up by reporting that only Samuel was found dead, making it look like a simple robbery gone wrong." The scope of the conspiracy's cruelty was almost beyond comprehension. Not only had they murdered innocent people for profit, but they'd taken pains to erase any evidence that Maria Cortez and her children had ever existed. In the official records, they were simply missing persons who'd presumably left the territory for parts unknown. Justice's behavior now made perfect sense. He hadn't just witnessed his owner's murder, he'd watched helplessly as his entire family was slaughtered. The dog's desperate attempts to lead someone to the evidence weren't just about justice for Samuel. They were about ensuring that Maria and the children weren't forgotten, that their deaths weren't allowed to disappear into the void of official indifference. "This changes everything," Doc said grimly. "We're not just dealing with robbery and corruption anymore. This is mass murder, the deliberate extermination of an entire family. When Marshal Crawford sees this evidence—" "If Marshal Crawford sees this evidence," Martha interrupted, "Rawlings knows we have the ledger, but he doesn't know about this. If he realizes we've discovered the full extent of his crimes, he'll stop at nothing to silence us." Ezra gathered the family photographs and documents, handling them with the reverence due to the last remnants of destroyed lives. Justice watched every movement, his eyes reflecting a pain that went beyond physical suffering into the realm of profound loss. "We need to get this to Crawford immediately," Ezra said. "Every day we wait gives Rawlings more time to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence." "Samuel Two Bears should have reached Helena by now," Martha replied. "If Crawford acts on Doc's letter, he could be here within days. And if he doesn't?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered but understood. If Marshal Crawford didn't respond to their plea for help, or if Rawlings discovered their hiding place before help arrived, then Justice's quest for justice would end the same way it had for his family, with their deaths and their truth buried forever. As evening fell over the abandoned homestead, they prepared for what might be their last night of freedom. Justice lay beside the family photograph, his head resting on his paws and his eyes fixed on the faces of the people he'd loved and lost. The dog's vigil was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a reminder that loyalty and love could survive even the worst that humanity had to offer. "Tomorrow we make our stand," Ezra said quietly, checking his father's revolver one more time. "Whatever happens, we make sure Justice's family gets the justice they deserve." Martha nodded, her hand resting on the knife she'd taken from her saloon's kitchen. "My father always said that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. This is one of those fights." Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their voices carrying across the prairie like mourning songs for the dead. But inside the ruined homestead, 3 humans and 1 loyal dog kept vigil over the evidence that would either bring down a criminal empire or serve as their own epitaph. The photograph of the Cortez family seemed to glow in the lamplight, their faces young and hopeful and completely unaware of the fate that awaited them. Justice's presence ensured they wouldn't be forgotten, that their deaths would have meaning beyond the profit they'd generated for their killers. In the morning, one way or another, the long wait for justice would finally come to an end. Dawn brought unwelcome news in the form of dust clouds on the horizon, riders approaching from the direction of Copper Ridge at a pace that suggested urgent business. Justice spotted them first, his hackles rising as he watched the distant figures resolve into Jake Rawlings and a larger group of armed men than they'd faced before. 8 riders, Martha observed through a crack in the homestead's wall. Rawlings brought reinforcements. Ezra studied the approaching group through Doc's medical telescope. The additional men had the hard look of professional killers, the kind who'd follow orders without question as long as the pay was adequate. Rawlings wasn't taking any chances this time. He intended to end their investigation permanently. "They must have found our trail," Doc said grimly. "Probably tracked us from the tunnel exit." Or they tortured the information out of someone in town, Martha replied, her voice tight with worry for her neighbors. The abandoned homestead offered little in the way of defensive advantages. The walls were sturdy enough to stop small arms fire, but they wouldn't hold against a determined assault by 8 experienced gunmen. Their only advantages were the evidence they'd gathered and Justice's uncanny ability to sense danger before it materialized. "We need to assume Crawford isn't coming," Ezra said, making the tactical assessment that none of them wanted to hear. "Either he never got our message, or Rawlings has people watching the trails from Helena. We're on our own." Martha checked her knife and the small pistol she'd retrieved from her husband's old belongings. "Then we make our stand here. We've got enough ammunition for a fight, and maybe we can take enough of them with us to send a message to whoever comes looking for answers." "There might be another way," Doc said quietly. He'd been studying the family documents with the intensity he usually reserved for complex medical cases. These papers prove the Cortez family owned significant property in the territory land that's worth a considerable fortune now that the railroad is coming through. What does that matter? Legal ownership passes to next of kin. If there are surviving relatives, they have legitimate claim to that property and the right to demand a full investigation into what happened to the original owners. Doc looked up from the documents with growing excitement. "Rawlings and his people have been using that land for their operations, probably selling or leasing it based on forged documents. If the rightful heirs surface, the whole conspiracy unravels." Ezra understood immediately. "We need to get these documents to legitimate authorities, not just to expose the murders, but to prove fraud on a massive scale." "The nearest territorial court is in Helena," Martha pointed out. "Same place we were already trying to reach. But now we have leverage beyond just the criminal evidence. We have proof of property theft worth thousands of dollars. That's the kind of crime that gets attention from territorial officials, even corrupted ones." Justice had moved to the window facing the approaching riders, his body tense with the controlled aggression of a dog preparing to defend his pack. The transformation from beaten victim to determined protector was complete. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he wouldn't go down without a fight. "They're close enough to see the smoke from our fire," Martha observed. "No point in pretending we're not here." Ezra made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of preparing defensive positions, he walked to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the homestead's sagging porch with his hands visible but ready to draw his weapon. "Jake Rawlings," he called out as the riders approached. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Rawlings rode closer, his expression confident despite the wariness in his eyes. He was a man accustomed to intimidating people through reputation alone, but something in Ezra's bearing suggested this confrontation wouldn't follow his usual script. "You've been a considerable inconvenience," Rawlings said, his voice carrying the casual menace of someone who'd ordered deaths as easily as ordering breakfast. "But inconveniences can be corrected with proper attention, like you corrected the inconvenience of the Cortez family." The slight tightening around Rawlings's eyes confirmed that he understood the significance of that question. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're wrong if you believe it changes anything. I've discovered enough to bring down your entire operation. The ledger, the property documents, the evidence of what really happened to Samuel, Maria, and their children." Ezra's voice remained steady despite the 8 gun barrels now pointed in his direction. "Justice here was the only witness who survived your massacre." Rawlings's gaze shifted to Justice, who had emerged from the house to stand beside Ezra. The dog's presence seemed to unsettle the crime boss in a way that human threats couldn't. "A dog can't testify in court," Rawlings said, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. "No, but the evidence he led us to can. Federal Marshal Crawford should be very interested in what we've uncovered." "Crawford's not coming," Rawlings replied with renewed confidence. "His messenger never made it past the mountain passes. Unfortunate accident with road agents seems to be a common problem in this territory." The revelation that their plea for help had been intercepted was devastating, but Ezra didn't let it show in his expression. Instead, he smiled with the grim satisfaction of a man playing his final card. Good thing we sent multiple messages then. Different routes, different messengers, different destinations. It was a bluff, but delivered with enough conviction to plant doubt in Rawlings's mind. Behind him, Ezra heard Martha and Doc preparing their weapons. Through the bond he'd developed with Justice, he sensed the dog's readiness to act when the moment came. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they weren't helpless. "You're going to die here today," Rawlings said flatly. "All of you, and this whole business will be buried with your bodies." "Maybe," Ezra agreed, "but dying for something worthwhile beats living as a coward who looks the other way while innocent families are slaughtered." The standoff stretched taut as both sides weighed their options. Rawlings's men were professional killers, but they were also mercenaries who expected to survive their assignments. The determination radiating from the defenders suggested this wouldn't be the easy execution they'd anticipated. Justice moved slightly, positioning himself to protect Ezra's flank while maintaining sightlines to the other threats. The dog's tactical awareness was remarkable. He understood the dynamics of the confrontation as clearly as any human combatant. "Last chance," Rawlings called out. "Surrender the evidence, and I'll make your deaths quick." "Counteroffer," Ezra replied. "Surrender yourselves to territorial authorities, and maybe some of you will live to see trial." Rawlings's laugh was ugly, but it carried less conviction than his threats. The crime boss was beginning to realize that intimidation alone wouldn't resolve this situation. They'd have to fight for what they wanted, and fighting meant casualties among his expensive hired guns. "Your choice," Rawlings said, raising his hand in preparation to signal the attack. In that suspended moment before violence erupted, Ezra felt the weight of all the decisions that had brought him to this point. A simple act of compassion for a beaten dog had led him into a fight that would determine whether justice was possible in a place where it had been systematically corrupted for years. Justice pressed closer to his leg, offering the silent support that had sustained them both through the darkest moments of their investigation. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, a man seeking redemption and a dog seeking justice for his murdered family. The medical bag Doc Harwell had prepared sat ready by the door, stocked with supplies for treating gunshot wounds and other battlefield injuries. It was a grim acknowledgement that their fight for justice would likely exact a terrible price from all of them. As Rawlings's hand began to fall, signaling the attack, Ezra drew his father's revolver with the smooth motion of a man who'd finally accepted that some battles couldn't be won with healing hands alone. The time for medicine had passed now, was the moment for justice, delivered at gunpoint under the unforgiving Montana sky. Rawlings's hand dropped like a falling axe, and the morning exploded into violence. Ezra threw himself sideways as the first volley of gunfire shattered the morning calm, splinters from the porch railing stinging his face as he rolled behind the dubious cover of an old water trough. Justice launched himself toward the nearest attacker with the fearless determination of a creature who had nothing left to lose. The dog's assault caught Rawlings's men completely off guard. They had prepared for a conventional gunfight with cornered humans, not a coordinated attack from an animal who seemed to understand battlefield tactics with startling clarity. Justice's powerful jaws clamped onto the gun arm of the closest rider, his weight and momentum dragging the startled gunman from his saddle as his horse reared in panic. Martha's pistol cracked from the doorway with deadly precision, her shot taking down a second attacker before he could bring his rifle to bear on Ezra's exposed position. Doc Harwell had positioned himself at the side window with an old hunting rifle, his medical training helping him maintain steady hands and clear thinking under fire as he took careful aim at the mounted targets. The Cortez family Bible lay open on the windowsill where they'd been studying the documents, its yellowed pages fluttering in the wind created by the chaos outside. The holy book had survived the massacre of its owners, preserving their names and family history even as their lives were stolen by greed. Now it bore witness to the reckoning that justice had sought for so many months. Ezra's first shot caught one of Rawlings's hired guns in the shoulder, spinning the man around but failing to drop him from his saddle. The wounded gunman tried to return fire with his offhand, but Justice had moved with tactical precision to position himself behind the man's spooked horse, using the terrified animal as cover, while continuing his relentless harassment of the mounted attackers. "The dog knows exactly what he's doing," Martha called out between shots, admiration clear in her voice despite the deadly circumstances. "He's keeping them from forming up for a coordinated assault on our position." It was remarkably true. Justice's movements weren't the random panic of a frightened animal, but followed a pattern that suggested extensive experience with violence and survival. The dog had learned hard lessons during his months of abuse, and those brutal teachings were now serving him in his quest for justice against the men who had destroyed his family. Silas Grady was among the attackers, his massive frame swaying precariously in the saddle as he fought to control his mount and draw a bead on Ezra. The drunk's aim was poor, compromised by years of alcohol abuse and the morning's liquid courage, but his shots were coming dangerously close to their defensive positions. "You should have minded your own business, stranger," Grady bellowed over the gunfire, his voice slurred but filled with murderous intent. "Should have let that worthless mutt die in the street like he deserved." "Some creatures deserve better than the masters they're given," Ezra replied, putting a bullet through the crown of Grady's hat. The near miss caused the big man to flinch violently, nearly losing his seat. "Just like some families deserve better than being murdered for their life savings." The reference to the Cortez family seemed to trigger something primal in Rawlings, who spurred his horse closer to the house despite the withering defensive fire. His face was twisted with a fury that went beyond simple anger into the realm of genuine madness, the rage of a man whose carefully constructed empire was crumbling before his eyes. "That Mexican family got exactly what they deserved," Rawlings snarled, his voice carrying across the battleground with venomous clarity. "They had money and land they were too weak to protect. In this territory, the strong take from the weak. That's the natural order of things." Justice's reaction to those words was immediate and terrifying to witness. The dog abandoned his careful tactical positioning and launched himself directly at Rawlings with a fury that seemed to transcend mere animal instinct. His leap carried him through the air with the grace of a predator, landing squarely on Rawlings's horse with enough force to stagger the animal. The crime boss's mount bucked violently, trying desperately to dislodge the attacking dog, while its rider fought to maintain his seat and aim his weapon. Justice's jaws sought Rawlings's throat with single-minded determination, his growls carrying a note of rage that chilled even the hardened gunman who witnessed it. The struggle was brief but incredibly intense. Justice's weight and ferocious determination proved too much for both horse and rider to handle effectively. Rawlings's rifle flew from his hands as he grappled with the avenging dog, his curses mixing with Justice's snarls in a symphony of violence. Both Rawlings and Justice crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, fury, and desperate struggle. The crime boss's rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as he hit the earth, but his hand was already moving toward the pistol at his hip with the practiced speed of a man who'd survived by being faster than his enemies. "Now," Ezra shouted to his companions, recognizing that Justice's bold sacrifice had created an opportunity they couldn't afford to waste. "Concentrate your fire while they're scattered." Martha and Doc shifted their aim to the remaining mounted attackers, their shots more accurate, now that the targets were focused on the dramatic struggle between their leader and the dog who'd haunted their criminal enterprise for months. Two more of Rawlings's hired guns toppled from their saddles, their horses scattering in panic as the carefully planned assault dissolved into bloody chaos. Ezra vaulted over the water trough and sprinted toward the desperate struggle between Justice and Rawlings, his father's revolver ready to end the crime boss's reign of terror permanently. But Silas Grady intercepted him halfway across the yard, the big man's bulk slamming into Ezra with the devastating force of a charging bull. They went down together in the dust, Grady's massive hands immediately seeking Ezra's throat with murderous intent. The drunk's strength was still formidable despite his dissipated condition, and his grip tightened with the focused malice of a man who enjoyed causing pain and had finally found a target for his rage. "Should have let the dog die in the street where I left him," Grady gasped, his breath reeking of whiskey and moral decay. "Should have minded your own damn business like everyone else in this godforsaken territory learns to do." Ezra's vision began to darken as Grady's grip cut off his air supply, but desperation gave him strength. He managed to work his revolver between their struggling bodies and pull the trigger, the muffled shot driving Grady backward, clutching his side. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it broke the drunk's stranglehold and gave Ezra the breathing room he desperately needed. Justice's battle with Rawlings had become a deadly dance of survival. The crime boss had managed to draw a wicked knife from his boot, slashing at the dog while trying to regain his footing and escape the animal's relentless attacks. Justice was faster and more agile, but the blade had already opened a gash along his ribs that stained his golden coat with bright crimson. The sight of Justice's blood awakened something primal and protective in Ezra, a fury that burned away his lifelong reluctance to take human life. He put his second shot directly through Silas Grady's heart, watching without a trace of remorse as the man who'd tortured Justice for months finally paid the ultimate price for his systematic cruelty. The echo of that final gunshot seemed to hang in the air like a judgment, marking the end of one chapter in their fight for justice and the beginning of whatever reckoning awaited them all. With Grady dead, Ezra turned his attention to Justice's desperate struggle with Rawlings. The crime boss had managed to pin the wounded dog beneath his weight, the knife poised to deliver a killing blow to the animal who destroyed his carefully constructed empire. "This ends now," Rawlings snarled, raising the blade. But Justice wasn't finished fighting. With a surge of strength born from months of abuse and the need to finally achieve justice for his murdered family, the dog twisted beneath Rawlings and clamped his jaws around the man's knife hand. The blade fell harmlessly to the dust as Rawlings screamed in pain and fury. Ezra reached them just as Rawlings drew a hidden derringer from his vest, the small weapon deadly at close range, despite its size. The crime boss's eyes held the desperate calculation of a man who knew he was facing his final moments if he was going to die. He intended to take Justice with him. The derringer's barrel swung toward Justice's head, and Ezra knew he wouldn't reach them in time to prevent the shot. But the dog seemed to sense the approaching danger, releasing his grip on Rawlings's hand and rolling aside just as the weapon discharged. The bullet meant for Justice instead caught Rawlings in his own leg, the crime boss's scream of agony echoing across the abandoned homestead. His fumbling attempt to reload the derringer gave Ezra the opening he needed to close the distance and press his revolver against the man's temple. "It's over," Ezra said quietly. "Your empire is finished." Rawlings looked up at him with the hatred of a man who'd built his power on the suffering of others and couldn't comprehend why anyone would risk their life to stop him. "You think killing me will change anything? There are others who'll take my place, others who understand that strength is the only law that matters." "Maybe," Ezra agreed, "but they'll have to do it without the evidence you've been so careful to collect." He gestured toward the homestead, where Martha and Doc were emerging with the bloody knife that had belonged to Silas Grady, the weapon used to murder the Cortez family, finally recovered after months of concealment. The blade bore stains that no amount of cleaning could completely remove, physical proof of the crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. Justice limped over to where they stood, his wound painful but not life-threatening. The dog's eyes were fixed on Rawlings, with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the crime boss's soul, reminding him of every innocent life he'd destroyed in pursuit of profit and power. "That dog cost me everything," Rawlings said bitterly. "One worthless animal brought down an operation that took years to build." "Justice isn't worthless," Ezra replied. "He's the only witness who survived your massacre, and he's spent months trying to lead someone to the truth. You underestimated him, just like you underestimated the people who'd be willing to fight for what's right." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their confrontation, but these riders carried the authority of legitimate law enforcement. Marshal Thomas Crawford had received their message after all, arriving with a federal posse just as the gunfight was reaching its conclusion. "Looks like we missed most of the excitement," Crawford said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who'd spent decades in the saddle. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in honest folks and fear in criminals. "Not all of it," Martha replied, nodding toward Rawlings. "The man who ordered the murders is still breathing, though he might not be for much longer if we don't get him medical attention." Crawford's men quickly secured the scene, gathering the surviving members of Rawlings's gang and collecting the evidence that would ensure justice was finally served. The ledger, the family documents, the bloody knife, all the proof they'd risked their lives to preserve would now see the light of day in a federal courtroom. But it was justice who provided the most compelling testimony, leading Crawford to locations where additional evidence had been buried, including the unmarked graves of Maria Cortez and her children. The dog's ability to find what others had tried to hide forever was uncanny, as if the spirits of the dead were guiding his search. "I've seen a lot of strange things in my years as a marshal," Crawford said, watching justice work. "But I've never seen an animal so determined to see justice done. It's almost like he understands what happened to his family and won't rest until everyone responsible pays for their crimes." "He understands more than most people give him credit for," Ezra replied, gently examining Justice's wound. The gash was clean and would heal well with proper care, but it would leave a scar to remind them of this final confrontation. As Rawlings was loaded into a wagon for transport to Helena, he made one final attempt to justify his actions. This territory was built by men willing to take what they needed to survive. The Cortez family was weak, defenseless. They had no right to wealth they couldn't protect. Justice's low growl silenced him more effectively than any human response could have. The dog's presence was a living refutation of Rawlings's philosophy, proof that loyalty and justice could triumph over cruelty and greed, given enough time and the right circumstances. The knife that had ended so many innocent lives was carefully wrapped and labeled as evidence, its bloody legacy finally exposed to the light of official investigation. Silas Grady's body was loaded onto a separate wagon, his reign of drunken brutality ended permanently by the man whose compassion had saved the dog he'd tortured for months. As the federal posse prepared to leave for Helena with their prisoners and evidence, Marshal Crawford approached Ezra with a proposition that surprised everyone present. "The territory needs men like you," he said quietly. "Men who'll stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous. I could use a deputy with medical training and the kind of moral courage you've demonstrated." Ezra looked down at Justice, who was watching the exchange with intelligent attention. The dog's journey from victim to survivor to seeker of justice was complete, but their partnership had formed bonds that transcended their original circumstances. "I'll consider it," Ezra replied, "but wherever I go, justice comes with me. We're partners now." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Wouldn't have it any other way. That dog's got better instincts for finding evidence than most federal agents I've worked with." As the official party departed for Helena, leaving Ezra, Martha, and Doc to begin the process of healing from their ordeal, Justice settled beside the grave markers they'd erected for the Cortez family. His vigil was finally complete. The truth had been exposed, justice had been served, and his family's memory would be honored rather than forgotten. The bloody knife that had caused so much suffering was gone forever, but its recovery had made possible the restoration of justice to a place where it had been systematically subverted for too long. In losing his family, justice had found a purpose that transformed personal tragedy into a force for good that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of Copper Ridge. 0.5. 6 months later, Copper Ridge had transformed from a town living in fear to a community where justice and compassion flourished. The Silver Dollar Saloon had become the unofficial meeting place for townspeople working to rebuild their home, with Martha serving as an informal leader whose wisdom and courage had earned universal respect. The simple wooden cross erected at the Cortez family grave had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, where travelers and locals alike came to pay their respects to the innocent victims whose deaths had exposed the corruption that once plagued the territory. Justice visited the site daily, his faithful vigil a reminder that love and loyalty could survive even the worst that humanity had to offer. Ezra had accepted Marshal Crawford's offer and now wore a deputy's badge, his medical skills and investigative instincts making him invaluable in bringing law and order to communities throughout Montana Territory. Justice accompanied him on every assignment, the dog's uncanny ability to find hidden evidence becoming legendary among federal law enforcement. Their partnership had evolved beyond the simple bond between man and animal into something approaching telepathy. Justice could read Ezra's intentions with remarkable accuracy, while Ezra had learned to interpret the subtle signals that indicated when the dog had discovered something important. Together, they'd solved cases that had baffled other investigators for years. The trial of Jake Rawlings and his surviving associates had made headlines throughout the territory, with newspapers calling it the most significant corruption case in Montana's history. The evidence they'd gathered had implicated dozens of officials, leading to resignations, prosecutions, and fundamental reforms in how territorial justice was administered. But perhaps most importantly, the property rightfully belonging to the Cortez family had been restored to Maria's surviving relatives in California. The substantial compensation they received couldn't bring back their murdered loved ones, but it ensured that Samuel, Maria, and their children hadn't died in vain. Doc Harwell had been appointed to the Territorial Medical Board, his detailed documentation of the conspiracy's crimes serving as a model for how medical professionals could support law enforcement efforts. His clinic had expanded to serve neighboring communities, and his reputation for integrity had attracted young doctors eager to learn from his example. Sheriff Murphy had been stripped of his badge and sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison, his collaboration with Rawlings's gang exposed in detail during the trial. His replacement was a veteran lawman from Denver who understood that effective policing required the trust and cooperation of the community being served. On this particular autumn evening, as golden light filtered through the windows of Martha's saloon, Ezra and Justice sat with their friends, celebrating the successful conclusion of their latest case. A ring of counterfeiters operating out of 3 counties had been dismantled, thanks largely to Justice's ability to locate their hidden printing equipment in an abandoned mine shaft. "You know what I find remarkable?" Doc said, raising his glass of Martha's finest whiskey. 6 months ago, we were ordinary people living ordinary lives. None of us expected to become heroes. "We're not heroes," Martha replied with characteristic directness. "We're just people who decided that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost." Ezra scratched behind Justice's ears, feeling the familiar warmth of the dog's presence beside him. The scar from Rawlings's knife had healed cleanly, but it served as a permanent reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything in their fight for justice. "Justice is the real hero," he said quietly. He survived months of abuse and never gave up hope that someone would eventually listen to what he was trying to tell them. His loyalty to his murdered family is what made everything else possible. As if understanding the tribute, Justice lifted his head and looked around the table at each of his human companions. His tail wagged once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed gratitude, affection, and the deep satisfaction of a mission finally accomplished. Outside, a new family of travelers was making camp near the creek that ran behind the town. They were immigrants from Ireland, drawn west by stories of opportunity and freedom, carrying everything they owned in a single wagon. In the old days, such vulnerable people would have been prime targets for predators like Rawlings and Grady. But now they could sleep peacefully under the Montana stars, protected by a community that had learned the value of standing together against those who would prey on the innocent. Justice's sacrifice and determination had created ripples of change that extended far beyond the boundaries of Copper Ridge. "What's next for you two?" Martha asked, nodding toward Ezra and Justice. "Crawford's got reports of rustling operations near the Wyoming border," Ezra replied. "Organized gangs stealing cattle from small ranchers who can't afford to fight back. Sounds like our kind of case. And after that?" Ezra looked down at Justice, whose brown eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had first caught his attention in the dusty street all those months ago. The dog had found his purpose in seeking justice for those who couldn't seek it for themselves, and their partnership had given Ezra's life a meaning he'd never expected to find. After that, there'll be another case, another group of people who need someone to stand up for what's right. He paused, reflecting on how far they'd both traveled from that night when he'd found a beaten dog lying abandoned in the street. "Justice taught me something important, that healing isn't just about medicine. Sometimes the best way to heal a broken world is to fight for the people who can't fight for themselves." Martha raised her glass in a toast that encompassed everything they'd been through together. To Justice the dog, who wouldn't let the truth stay buried, and the man who had the courage to listen. As glasses clinked around the table, Justice settled more comfortably beside Ezra's chair, his eyes already turning toward the window and the road that would take them to their next adventure. Somewhere out there, innocent people were being threatened by those who believed that strength was the only law that mattered. But they were wrong, as Jake Rawlings and Silas Grady had learned too late. In a world where cruelty and corruption often seemed to triumph, the simple partnership between a compassionate man and a loyal dog had proven that justice was still possible for those brave enough to seek it. The wooden cross at the Cortez family grave stood silhouetted against the evening sky, a permanent reminder that love and loyalty could transcend even death. Maria, Samuel, and their children finally rested in peace, knowing that their deaths had meaning beyond the profit they'd generated for their killers. And somewhere in the distance, new travelers were making their way toward Copper Ridge, drawn by stories of a place where justice flourished and compassion was more than just a word. They would find sanctuary in a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they decided that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. Justice's tail thumped against the floor once more, a sound of contentment and purpose that seemed to say their work was far from finished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to stand up for what was right, new chances to prove that in the endless struggle between good and evil, good could still triumph when it was backed by courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog.